afternoon, Colleen, and welcome to Santa Barbara.
Well, it's great to be here. I kind of felt like we were making a grand entrance on a play or something with this change of scene, but I noticed we don't have a backdrop, so thank you so much for inviting me.
One of the things I'd like to start off with is it true that one of the earlier inspirations for you for a life in law enforcement came from the television show The Man from U.N.C.L.E.?
Well, actually, that's a well-known, because Time Magazine picked up on that. Obviously, they're in the business of making magazines, but it actually is a true story. And I suppose anyone who's over 50 or so out there remembers this was a very good show that many of us. And in fact, later on in the FBI, you find out lots of people. There was, even before The Man from U.N.C.L.E., there was Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., and you actually find out that many people do choose their careers based on television shows. Unfortunately, we had X-Files after all these things. But I got so excited about Man from U.N.C.L.E. that I wrote to our newspaper, our local newspaper, and said, I want to join U.N.C.L.E. Can you give me their address so I can write to them? I was 11. And they wrote back in this column in the paper, said, unfortunately, U.N.C.L.E. is fictional, but in the United States, we have the closest thing is the FBI. And then they gave me the address to write to the FBI. I wrote the FBI. And I got J. Edgar Hoover's little pamphlet back, 99 Facts, which included fact number 60, why can't women become FBI agents?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I want to read part of that section there. It says, does the FBI employ women as special agents? And it says, because of the hazardous nature of some of the duties special agents are called upon to perform, the FBI does not employ women in this position. Special agents must be qualified to cope with any situation they may be called upon to face. Women do, however, hold many important positions in the FBI as stenographers, typists, switchboard and teletype operators, clerks, radio dispatchers, laboratory aides. They render valuable services. And this is by J. Edgar Hoover. But what surprised me the most when we were talking a few weeks ago, I would have presumed that this had been written before World War II. And this came out, you said, in the 70s.
Right. The FBI was one of the very last federal agencies and was threatened with, of course, lawsuits. But it took Hoover's death. And actually, he assigned somebody, I think around 71, the final time. There's actually 3 pages. This is a short synopsis of a long, convoluted, very creatively written reasons, which never come out right and say, why can't women become agents? But it talks all around it. And if there's any women's studies people out there who want a topic for a thesis, I've got it.
Well, this is an interesting point here. With such a male-dominated culture as the FBI certainly was at that time, how did you become a special agent?
Well, what happened is after Hoover died, then there was still long-standing resistance to bringing women in. So they only hired, I think, 5 or 6 from the time of 72 to 78. William Webster was the new director in 78, and he's the one who actually put a little bit of a push on. And then I went to law school. I was already in law school when Webster became director, and I actually went to law school with the idea of joining the FBI, knowing that, of course, law, and at a certain point I thought either the Foreign Service or the FBI, and I was taking both of those tests and simultaneously, and we had an FBI coordinator who flew to the law school in my senior year, and it turns out that this would have been 79. And in 79, it was not a cool thing to join the FBI. Only 2 people in my class signed up to interview with him, out of 300 and some. So I was already an oddball back even in law school. And then it turned out the law school barred the FBI for over 10 years from even coming to recruit in the law school. I think it was perceived discrimination or something, issue like that. So because I was one of the only people to talk to him, it was like he gave me a heads up, in terms of all of the procedures, and it took me over a year to go through the testing, the interview, background investigation, as well as a physical. It took me about a year and a half to get hired from the time I was out of law school.
And then you were a special agent. How did you become a special agent?
Well, again, it's this long procedure, and when you get appointed, it's still not for sure. Once you get appointed, I took the oath of office the same hour as Ronald Reagan. I don't know, I'm not getting any applause for that, but he was on the television actually in Omaha as I was saying the same words. What a deal, huh? And I got the day off. My very first day in federal employment, I was given the day off because it was Inauguration Day in Washington and I couldn't fly off to D.C. But then I went to, all agents go through about 4 months of training, and physical training and firearms training and a lot of testing. It goes on for about 14, 15 weeks. And we actually have people that fail out of that too. So even though you're appointed. But if you make it through all of that, then you go to your first office. And I began to work white-collar crime, and eventually I was assigned to New York City. And I would say probably the bulk of my time in the FBI, I worked mafia cases, organized crime in New York.
Well, let's get to the part where you're in the Minneapolis field office now. When did you first hear the name Carlos Masali?
The night, let's see, this would have been August 16th, and he had just come to the attention of the FBI because the flight school had called our agents a couple of days before that. And we had a very astute agents. I noticed the film once said Rowley's agents. Not true. They weren't my agents. They were, I was the legal counsel in the office, so I was not their boss. But they went out and they investigated, and within a couple of days, they already really had a very good idea that this was something quite suspicious. And in fact, the flight instructor, the first flight instructor who called the FBI was a whistleblower. He was going against his bosses. He was calling about a customer. And in essence, what's happened, if you know the story of flight schools, most of the foreign pilots now, this is all dried up as a result of this. So he was a whistleblower. The agents did a great job. They had a lot of facts. They put it down in about 16 pages. They sent out leads immediately to England and to France. And I don't know how many people now have read the 9/11 Commission report, but the 9/11 Commission report has a lot of this in there, the various suspicious things. It's a lot more than what you saw in the paper. And then here's the bad thing. Our headquarters, we were seeking then a warrant to search not only his laptop computer, but his personal effects. The law has, average people, unless you're a defense attorney, don't know all these technicalities of when you can search and when you can't. But if you have somebody who's involved in espionage or terrorism, you can get a secret court warrant, and it's the most appropriate, it applies. But you got to go through headquarters. An agent can't do that on their own. You can't go to a district judge. And this is where all the problems with bureaucracy, and there were a lot of reasons for it. What happened is over time, the agents then got information from France specifically that really added to the probable cause. I said that in my memo. And yet the warrant still was being denied. Now, when the 9/11 happens, I ran to a television that was just an office away from mine and saw the plane. I suppose it was a replay. Saw one of the planes flying into the World Trade Center. And it was really essentially about a minute and a half. It was like, oh my gosh, this is happening. Oh, it's related to the person here. I mean, it was that quick. It was about a minute. And in fact, my paralegal was behind me, and I said, oh, this has to be related to the case we have here. And so at the same time, calls were being made to the case agents and then calls to headquarters. And I got, caught up in this. When I was called the night of August 16th, where it was the night that Masali was taken into custody, I was called. I was already in bed. I think I went to bed early, about 9 o'clock that night, and the phone rings, and it's these agents. I don't get called at home, hardly ever, unless it's really something important. So that right there is a tip-off that this is something important. And yet, after 9/11, this need to protect the Bureau and not quite admit, certainly not unravel all of this dirty laundry type baggage that had gone along with it. Which, of course, not only was I a legal person in the FBI, but I was our ethics teacher. Beginning in the early 90s, 93, 94, we gave Office of Government Ethics to all of our training about what you could accept, the types of things, the corruption, you can only accept $19 for a gift, and conflicts of interest where you have to recuse yourself if you have investments in the case, in a company involved in the case, things like that. But then beginning in about 97, 98, the director at the time, kind of like, the introduction said that this is a need for ethics because of, everyone kind of looks out at the country and unethical and lapses and says, what, we need to give some ethics training. The military academies had cheating scandals going on at the time. Our FBI had 2 cases of drunken driving homicides with involving agents. And so the director, Louis Freeh, mandated law enforcement ethics, which is a little bit different than the Office of Government Ethics. It was basic right and wrong stuff. And as it turns out, I had given a PowerPoint ethics presentation to our office a week before 9/11. And there were a couple of slides in that ethics presentation, one of which is, we owe our highest loyalty to the U.S. Constitution, never say or do anything to prevent institutional embarrassment. Remember, your highest loyalty is to the Constitution. That was one, and then there was another one, do not puff, shade, skew, massage, tailor, firm up, or otherwise, exaggerate the facts. And both of those were being violated just really essentially within days of us having, and I wasn't the only one to give that PowerPoint. That was given nationwide a week before 9/11.
So essentially what you're saying is the PowerPoint presentation, the ethics went out the window when all of this stuff happened.
Yeah, and of course, we were talking before this that we can talk and talk and talk about ethics, but honestly, it's the application, it's living through this, it's really confronting the hard dilemma. And there's a perfect example. I have to even admit, when I was pressing this PowerPoint, I wasn't taking it all that seriously. I was reading it. Do not puff, shade, skew. Okay, folks, do not puff, shade, skew. I was kind of reading it. The week after, when I finally saw that we were in flagrant violation, is when it hit me. And of course, now I've got it memorized. It's part of my being. But
tell us what led to your decision to write the memo to Director Mueller.
After 9/11, again, this is history, and of course, you got to read the 9/11 Commission report to kind of remember this. For a long, long period of time, there was little, if any, impetus to investigate, to basically unravel the mistakes. Part of ethics, it's the painful, icky part of ethics, but it certainly is a big part, is unraveling mistakes. It first requires admitting the mistake. I mean, right off the start. If you remember after 9/11, Condi Rice said, well, there's a movie out right now called 9/11 Press for Truth. Has anyone seen it? Anyone? It's actually a pretty good movie. It's a little documentary. It's called 9/11 Press for Truth, and they have all that old footage of Condi Rice saying, well, I don't think anyone would have known that someone would hijack a plane and fly it into a building. Guess what? All kinds of people knew. There had been prior plots. I mean, you start looking at this. Actually, Condi Rice herself had been involved in protection for the G8. They had even exercises along these lines. There had been anyways, there was that was one thing. Our FBI director said something for about 3 weeks. He said, well, no one could have prevented 9/11. If we had had any idea, maybe we could have prevented 9/11. If we'd had any inkling of this. And of course, he was actually called on the day of 9/11 about the Mazenawi case. The agents in Minnesota were so worried that the case itself would be covered up. In order to prevent this embarrassment that, that there was a terrorist connection already known. And there are things about this terrorist connection. For instance, our acting supervisor, August 23rd, 24th, in arguing with headquarters to go for this warrant, and the guy was saying, no, we can't do it. Our acting supervisor had said, this is a guy who could fly into the World Trade Center. And that was said in August 2001. Can you imagine how embarrassing this is? And of course, Mueller knows it. He knows that was even said very quickly. Now, and of course, so for 3 weeks, he's saying, well, if we had known, we may have been able to prevent it. I tried to call the director, and this is after 9/11, to get him to stop saying that, because I said, oh my gosh, when this comes out. And I knew there had been emails flying between our office and headquarters. I didn't know there were 70 emails. When our agent testified recently in the Masali case, it comes out there's 60, 70 emails. I knew that the communication that they had tried to seek was several pages long and included a lot of facts. And I knew I knew a lot of the arguments that had taken place, but I didn't know all of it. So when he said that, I tried to call the director's office, and I got to somebody where I know he knew, because he had just been in that office and they would tell him and stuff. And of course he continued to say it. He continued to say it until the case leaked to the press. And the case leaked to the press. One of our agents, or one of our supervisors, was testifying in Congress, and the press learned of it. I think it was Newsweek, I can't remember. And they started asking him questions of embarrassing things. He was almost caught, and again, with this lying thing. He was very close to being caught in outright not telling Congress the truth, because he was going with what he thought he had to say.
Now, this is all that
This
led
is
up
all
to
in the first 3.5 weeks. Well, after then the Masali case leaked, then the official things changed dramatically to the other thing. Well, even though we know this, we couldn't have prevented it. There was no probable cause. That held for about 8 months, 8.5 months. And beginning in the spring of 2002, an inquiry started by the Joint Intelligence Committee. And there were hearings. FBI Director Mueller and others were called a little bit. We had to hand over documents. I don't know how many documents were being handed over freely, but there were documents, and a timeline was being created. Some of the timeline was kind of a cherry-picking thing, where some facts that were advantageous to the line that we couldn't have done anything were in there, and some of the facts that were not so advantageous to the argument that we could have done something were left out. And so when I had the chance, when I got called that I was going to be debriefed by the staff of the Joint Intelligence Committee, I literally did not sleep for 2 nights. And part of it was I wanted to make sure I was going to tell the truth. I knew the agents were too. The agent that was the investigator only had 3 years in the FBI, and his supervisor only had 5. And I was the legal person with 20 years. As it turns out, the crux of this was a legal argument in this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, probable cause. So I knew that my part of this was going to go to the crux of it, which was the legal argument, and our headquarters was kind of resting its hat on. So I determined on the second night of not sleeping, about 3:30 a.m., and I said, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. I keep going over in my head everything I'm going to have to tell them. I don't want to forget anything. I am going to write it down. I'm going to jot down. Initially, I just started saying, I'm going to jot it all down so I don't forget anything. And I went to the office. I got up at 3:30. I got up because I wasn't sleeping. Got up, drove to the office, and about 4:30, I began typing on my computer. I typed all day long with interruptions, of course, but from about 4:30 till about 8:30 at night, I was typing this. I had about 8-9 pages done. And about that time, it dawned on me, I got to do something more. And what dawned on me was that we had not had an investigation. You know, our FBI had an Office of Professional Responsibility, like its own internal affairs. And if anyone had asked them to investigate, it hadn't happened. And I also knew about the Phoenix memo by that time. Of course, before 9/11, no one in our office knew that a whole other office in Phoenix had already written up a memo asking the FBI to look into flight school training. No one knew that before 9/11, but of course we learned of it about a week or 2 later. Not only was our office, but here was another memo. And it turns out there's even something more than that. There's a third, what they call a dot, connecting the dots. There's another third dot that's even probably more significant than Masali or the Phoenix memo, and that is that 2 hijackers who were on the CIA's terrorist list had come in here to California. And it turns out, this is all in the 9/11 Commission report, but it turns out they were actually living with an FBI, the landlord for the place they were living was an FBI source. I mean, it's just incredible. We had an FBI agent in New York. Now, when you're asking for facts to be unraveled, this will always be the case. I didn't know all of this. I knew about the Masali case, and I knew certain things were being covered up, but I didn't know the whole gamut. But I knew enough to know that we had to really unravel this. And again, there was a lot of resistance to having a full investigation.
Well, before we get to some of the points in the memo here, because I think it's important to remind people of some of these points, let's have a brief timeline of events here with this. Who received the memo and in what order?
Well, so on May 21st, I only had, I don't know, about 4 or 5 days lead time from the first call, and 2 of those nights I wasted by not starting. So I only really had about 3 days to put this together. I flew to Washington, D.C. on May 21st. I was, knowing I was going to give this memo, and that that's what I meant, that little comment in the thing was, I knew it was going to ruffle some feathers. I had no idea it was going to become public, but I knew that, by saying these things about my management, it was not going to be a happy time. So I was quite nervous about the whole thing. I talked to the staffers themselves, but this is so long, you don't want to hear it. I was in the FBI space when this interview took place with the staffers. And the staffers themselves were all retired, Secret Service, CIA, Department of Justice, and FBI. And actually, I wasn't even sure that my memo would make it out of the staff. One of the people that was the head of the staff doing the FBI was a 31-year-long retired FBI agent legal counsel. And I don't know that this is the case, but he had been alleged to have obstructed a prior inquiry on Waco, the Danforth inquiry. And he was the one doing the 9/11. And I think he's a good guy, I knew him and stuff, but I had the tiniest bit of doubt. So I had minders from the FBI in this interview. So when this interview, it's about 2.5 hours, I tried to remember and I told them most of these things. But when the interview was done, they said, do you have anything else to add? And I pulled out of my case, I said, well, if I did forget anything, I wrote it all down in this memo. And so I gave them the memo, and then I proceeded. I had copied our internal affairs, so I had to find that office in the FBI. And of course, the memo itself was directed to the director. So I had to find the director's office, and of course, the FBI, the Hoover building is this maze. And walking through the FBI at that point, my knees were just about like mush trying to find these places, and knowing I was handing this memo off. And then, after I'd found those 2 offices and dropped them off, the night before I left to fly to Washington, I tacked. I said, you know what? I'm only handing this off mostly internally. And again, being afraid of the staff possibly not filtering it, I said, you know what? I'm going to take it directly to some of the senators on the Joint Intelligence Committee. And what I didn't appreciate, to be honest, at the time, and I've now, of course, had many occasions to listen to people like Ellsberg and others that have explained that, these 3 branches of government often treat each other as the enemy. And I frankly did not understand that the executive branch and the legislative branch, especially when an inquiry was going on, that this would be, and they have top secret classifications like I do. I didn't understand that giving it, and I tacked on, the reason I picked Dianne Feinstein and Richard Shelby. It turns out I don't think Richard Shelby was the best person to give it to, but I gave it to him. And the only reason I picked those 2 is I saw that they were people asking questions in the Joint Intelligence Committee. And I went to the Senate Hart Building and found their offices and handed their staff in closed envelopes. I went home, flew back home. A day later, it was a whole 24 hours later that I get this call about 6 o'clock in the evening that CNN has heard that there is some memo written. And I went, oh my gosh, They didn't have the memo at that time, but they had heard, somebody probably in Congress had talked to somebody who had talked to somebody, so it took about 24 hours. And then the next day after that, I had somebody in our headquarters call me who had heard our head people, I'm not sure who this would have been, but I'm assuming the highest levels, talking about firing me.
Well, let me read a few points to refresh everybody's memory for this memo, because it's been some time since we've heard about this. You say in the first part here, the issues, Director Mueller, are fundamentally ones of integrity and go to the heart of the FBI's law enforcement mission and mandate. The Minneapolis agents who responded to the call about Musawi's flight training identified him as a terrorist threat from a very early point. As the Minneapolis agents' reasonable suspicions quickly ripened into probable cause, they became desperate to search the computer laptop that had been taken from Masali. Even after the attacks had begun, the supervisory special agent in question was still attempting to block the search of Masali's computer, characterizing the World Trade Center attacks as a mere coincidence within Minneapolis's prior suspicions about Masali.
Yeah.
Now, how could this guy possibly think that this was a coincidence that just at least couldn't be explored or looked at?
We can talk about denial because it occurs on every level all the time. Global warming is a great example. I mean, I think it's a natural human thing that when bad things happen, look at Jeffrey Wigand and tobacco smoke, denial for how many years that smoking cigarettes causes cancer. And so this is not, and again, this was pretty darn quick, but I actually was on the phone. I suppose it's an hour, hour and a half into the attack. I don't even know exactly where we were in the timeline. When we then call headquarters to try to finally, at that point, say, oh my gosh, you've been saying no, 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 it's happened. I mean, I know this is exactly, it's happened now. We have got to get the warrant now, come on. And the person, and in my phrase to the person who was the supervisor not allowing this to go forward, I said, at this point, if this is not related, it has to be the hugest coincidence. And he picked up on it and said, yes, I think that's what it is, a coincidence.
Well,
and don't do anything. Of course, headquarters, their purpose is to coordinate different office actions. And so they would always say, well, don't your office do anything. You might ruin some other office. I mean, that's always the thing that said, don't do anything without our say-so. And it took, what it actually took to get the yes from them was the Pentagon. I walked from that telephone call into the other office of my boss, and he's on a line with that person's superior, and about that time, within about 10 minutes or so, the plane goes into the Pentagon. And at that point, we see it on the television, and he says, oh, a third plane has just gone into the Pentagon, and they finally, it took the three planes before they said, yes, go for the warrant.
I see. Well, this is interesting in light of the recent issue where the FBI has been improperly obtaining thousands of phone conversations, business and financial records without prior judicial approval. This is against the Patriot Act. They've been abusing the Patriot Act. Now, do you think that this is like an overreaction as a result of what happened with 9/11?
Yeah, and you saw, and actually Mr. Wallach's selecting of these two clips up there is pretty good, because what you have, and of course 9/11, the common phrase is 9/11 changed everything. Well, it does change everything, but it's kind of a self-fulfilling, neocons say we make our own reality. So if you make your own reality and you say 9/11 changes everything, well then it does. And certainly you have a pendulum that swings from actions that are over here, and certainly we want to have emergency exceptions always. That's one of the key things to have, is an emergency exception, so that you don't have those barriers and those obstacles. But you have a pendulum that swings from here way over. And what I argue is that when it swings way over to this over-collection, attacking countries that had nothing to do with 9/11, torturing, which isn't even good for, it's not even good to get good intelligence, all of these things that we've done in a senseless, reckless, non-thinking way don't help us. And again, this is, and also, of course, all of the, what I always, I'm the teacher of the agents, and I always say this is a green light. And I always felt bad because I knew that as this was happening, it took a couple years for it to fully swing this way, but as it was happening, you saw it happening. And you knew that people were going to get in trouble. Now, these national security letters, I had a role in those initially when they were first done, and they started off judicious. There were only 8,000 done in 2001. Then they went up to, I don't know all the years, but the final year in 2005, 56,000. And so since 9/11, there's been probably well over 200,000. And these national security letters, for people who don't know, You obtain credit records, bank records, your telephone tolls, your email records, not the content of your emails, but the to and froms you obtain with those. And actually, post office records, it was broadened once in Patriot Act 2. So what we're doing is we're flooding the system with a ton of information. And this is just one area where it's an overreaction. An example is Christmas of 2003, I believe, there was a tip that a terrorist was going to Las Vegas. And so, again, partly spurred by fear, wanting to err on the side of caution, they obtained the hotel records for everyone in Las Vegas in a 2-week period of time over Christmas. So if you were in Las Vegas in Christmas of 2003, your name is probably in a file somewhere to this day.
I think I was in Las Vegas then. Let me return to the memo here briefly. You say here in point 8, in the day or two following September 11th, you, Director Mueller, made the statement to the effect that if the FBI had only had any advance warning of the attacks, this is what you talked about before, we, meaning the FBI, may have been able to take some action to prevent the tragedy. Fearing that this statement could easily come back to haunt the FBI upon revelation of the information that had developed pre-September 11th about Mazenawi, I and others in the Minneapolis office immediately sought to reach your office through an assortment of higher-level contacts in order to quickly make you aware of the background of the Mazenawi investigation and to forewarn you so that your public statements could be accordingly modified. When such statements from you and other FBI officials continued, we thought that somehow you had not received the message, and we made further efforts. Finally, we faced the sad realization that the remarks indicated someone, possibly with your approval, had decided to circle the wagons at headquarters in an apparent effort to protect the FBI from embarrassment and the relevant FBI officials from scrutiny. Everything I have seen, you continue, and heard about the FBI's stance and the FBI's internal preparations in anticipation of further congressional inquiry had unfortunately confirmed my worst suspicions in this regard. Now you're talking further along in the memo where they made a corrected statement, and you say the official statement is now to the effect that even if the FBI had followed up on the Phoenix lead to conduct checks of flight schools and the Minneapolis request to search Mazenawi's personal effects and laptop, nothing would have changed, and such actions certainly could not have prevented the terrorist attacks and resulting loss of life. With all due respect, you say, this statement's as bad as the first.
You know, it's a comforting statement, though, to thousands of government employees that we couldn't have prevented 9/11. And pretty much, most people had something they had done wrong. And it went from the lowest levels, the visa stampers. We had visa stamped and sent to Mohammed Atta 2 months after 9/11. We had the security people, now you've seen on videotapes that let Atta by, even though they stopped him briefly. Those were the low levels, and of course then you get to the mid-levels, like maybe the management in the FBI. You get to the director levels. At the director level, one thing that I didn't know when I wrote the memo, I didn't know that George Tenet had been briefed on the case. Now it took the 9/11 Commission to actually point blank ask this. Now, and he wasn't just CIA director. There's so much disinformation and misinformation. George Tenet was the director of Central Intelligence of all 15 agencies. And this case it was stopped at a mid-level in the FBI, but it went right to the top in the CIA. And he was briefed in a PowerPoint sometime August. Again, it was August 23rd, 24th. I think it was entitled Fundamentalist Learns to Fly. Now, after 9/11, on the morning of 9/11, there had been one tiny little leak. Somebody having breakfast with him that somebody ran in and said, George, Mr. Tenet, there's an attack. And the first words out of his mouth was, I wonder if it's related to the Minnesota. So he was like us. He had he knew right off the bat. Now, why didn't George? Again, all of these things, it's so important to understand. It's not to cause, what's the word? It's not to blame someone. It's not to find fault or criticize George Tenet. The reason for unraveling this is because the fix, the remedy that we do afterwards so that we can try to prevent this from happening again depends on what the mistake was. Now, if you know that the information, in fact, made it to the right person, then you don't have the same types of fixes. Now, one of the fixes after 9/11 is that we have a new intelligence czar. But in fact, that isn't kind of it doesn't really help much because that wasn't the problem. It had made it to George Tenet all the way up. I've forgotten what the question was.
Well, let's get back to
the prevention part.
Right.
There were at least 2 or 3 ways that 9/11 could have been prevented. One is, of course, if that Phoenix memo, which requested information, requested investigation of flight schools. And if that had been done quickly, as it was urgent, it was an urgent memo, and if it had been read, the guy denied he read it afterwards. I don't know if it's true or not, but he denied even reading it. Of course, Alberto Gonzalez, forgets a lot of things, so who knows. But one way was if the FBI had reacted quickly, it's possible that some of these other people, like Mohammed Atta, might have stood out, and maybe another flight instructor, as the Minnesota one, would have put us on the trail. That's one way. That's probably the least likely way. The second way is that Musawi's, if it had been searched, his personal effects, it's not his laptop, there's a lot of misinformation, but his personal effects connect to the masterminds. This Ramzi bin al-Shib and stuff, his personal effects, it takes investigation, and it takes a few weeks to do that, because it's through a fingerprint and other things. But it connects directly to the plot. That's the second way. The third way is just for George Tenet, with all of the information he has, 52 warnings to the FAA, 5 or 6 which were to access the cockpit, I think, or hijack planes. All of this information that's available to him, there's all kinds of foreign information, probably to this day, I don't even know all of it, that he had to order the cockpit, or at least give the information so that the cockpit doors would be hardened and bolted. There are people now in aviation that have said this is the easiest way to prevent that kind of attack. And you know what it costs? At the time, people would say, well, we couldn't have possibly done that. Bolt the cockpit doors. We did it immediately after 9/11. It costs about $900 per door is what it costs. And again, many times that little ounce of prevention, and again, it's stopped because of people saying, oh, it's too much money. But of course, in how much cost that came from 9/11. Mm-hmm. And again, with all of this information, there's a strong argument that somebody should have, and Israel's airlines already bolted the cockpit doors.
Well, getting back to a little bit more personal aspect of all of this, you're going through all of this stuff, the memo has been released, it's now been distributed to the media. What was your family's reaction to all of this?
Well, when I drove home, let's see.
You're a mother of 4, to remind everybody here, and a husband, and he stays home with the kids while you work. So you're a single-parent breadwinner for the family there of 6 people. And this was a pretty risky thing to put this memo out.
The media getting a hold of it was a double-edged sword, because as it turns out, of course, it's got a lot of bad sides about the media, but as it turns out, I now recognize if the media hadn't gotten it, Time Magazine got it pretty quick, I think New York Times, I'm not sure what other, but if they had not actually gotten a hold of this memo, in all probability, I could have been fired. Once the media had it, and it almost forced Director Mueller to not fire me. Although there was about a week where this was a little bit in question. They called Mueller and Ashcroft that weekend on the Sunday morning news shows, and Director Mueller pretty quickly said, no, she won't be fired. But Ashcroft, it took about 3 times of asking him before he finally kind of just went like this.
Now, before your testimony, before the Senate committee, you had a meeting with Director Mueller. Can you tell us about that?
June 6th, which was the night before I was going to testify, I think that it was pretty unprecedented that I had been called to Congress. In the FBI, if you get called, first of all, you're always high level. The director testifies, sometimes lower assistant directors testify. Sometimes maybe even the head of organized crime or something would testify. No GS-14 we had some supervisor whistleblowers the year before who testified about a double standard, but even I'm not quite sure if their stuff, their material that they were presenting wasn't previewed. I'm not sure about that. Mine, I didn't allow to be previewed. So here I am, kind of a real unknown quantity, and we'd had our Phoenix agent doing this the 2 weeks before, and the FBI, of course, tries to get the person on their side. So I don't know why Mr. Mueller, wanted to talk to me the night before I testified, but I'm assuming, he probably wanted to, kind of get a read on what I was going to say and stuff. And we had about a 20-minute, maybe 25-minute talk, and he said, "Colleen, I'm just like you. I'm sure this is partially true." He said, I'm very critical. I like to hear about mistakes and fix them. If there's ever a time that you see something, bad or wrong, I would love to hear about it. So I heard that on June 6th. And of course, getting into February 2003, just, flash forward a few months. Now I've got Director Mueller standing idly by as Vice President Cheney says that Mohammed Atta, the 9/11 hijacker, met with Iraqi intelligence in Prague. And Director Mueller knows there's a ticket stub that shows Mohammed Atta was in the United States and that Iraqi intelligence never met with the 9/11. He knows there's no connection between the 9/11 hijackers. We got 69, again, it's kind of hard to talk now from this, it's almost history, but on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, 69% of our country believed that Saddam Hussein was connected to Osama bin Laden. Mm-hmm. And it was carefully put out that way. And George Tenet, not just Mueller, but Mueller and Tenet were standing there allowing this to happen when they should have been, they should have been whistleblowers in essence. So I decided, okay, I remembered back to June 6th. He said, anytime. And, if there's anything, whistleblower, you can't do it for little minor matters. You definitely have to pick your battles. It has to be serious life and death. But if anything was serious life and death, it's starting an unjustified, ill-conceived, going to be counterproductive war that's not, it's not even based on the facts that people are saying. So I wrote a memo in February that I emailed to him on February 26th of 2003. This real, throw the kitchen sink in. Every argument I could think of, and not only argument, but factually based things that had already happened since 9/11 that were wrong, that the post-9/11 roundup was in there, the orange alerts were in there. I thought of everything that I could think of that would argue that this is, I actually made the comparison of Waco to invading Iraq. And actually, if you think about it, it was kind of apt at the time because here you had madman, which is true. You had Saddam as a madman. Well, David Koresh in Waco was a madman with weapons and two, mm-hmm. But yet we had the good intentions of saving the people in Waco, but yet it turned out horrible. So I had made this big analogy in my paper, sent it to him February 26th, and never got a word back. No response back. The days tick by, and then I get to March 7th, and now, of course, we're have all of our troops ready to invade, and I didn't know what to do, so I went to the paper.
Where does the case with Masali stand now?
He has been prosecuted, and what I allude to in here, this is a huge issue. He was prosecuted in criminal court, and perhaps there are very few, he's the only person prosecuted in connection with the 9/11 plot. There have been others prosecuted for aiding, and abetting, or proceeds somehow connected to terrorist proceeds, much lesser things, but not connected to the actual 9/11 plot. We have a couple of people. We have the two masterminds, and they're not going to be prosecuted in criminal court. They are going to be prosecuted in the enemy combatant military commission mm-hmm. thing. So Masali case, after all of the mistakes, and the mistakes don't just exist pre-9/11, they also exist after 9/11, because I would say that if you have a terrorist and you don't know if there are planes up, you need to talk to that person to see if they can give you more information. and yet he was never debriefed or talked to, so there's all kinds of things. But given all those mistakes that occur in the Masali case, he's eventually prosecuted in criminal court, lots and lots of issues there with how this is done. But you know what? He was convicted, and it went to a death penalty phase. The jury came back, and he got life in prison. And you know what? I think there's a pretty good consensus. Again, it's pretty obvious. Many people think, well, that's probably after everything is a decent outcome on that case. And actually, Masali himself was almost surprised afterwards. He goes out of the thing, and he's surprised that he got justice. So in the midst of all of this overreaction and injustice and torturing innocent people and everything else, that case ultimately stands for the principle that you can try a terrorist in criminal court. And that's a radical thing to say now in our country, that you can use law enforcement on terrorism. I hope people will pick up on that and use it more, but right now, of course, we use our military and this blunt tool and civilian populations and everything. The good thing about law enforcement going after terrorists is it's a lot more surgical. And because our laws have evolved with these thresholds of probable cause and going into court and having to prove it, I think it actually lessens the impact of terrorism. In a way, you're making Masali just like an old mob, a terrible thug, drug gang leader, or a mob boss. You're not elevating them to statehood by saying it's a war with a state. And I think there are just many things that we should use our criminal courts more like we did. And I think the Masali case was actually an example of success. But many people, the people who are saying, oh, you don't understand. And I think I do understand, because I worked in this stuff for 20-some years. And we prosecuted many terrorists before 9/11 successfully in criminal court.
Before we allow questions from the audience here, I'd just like to finish up with one thing. One of the things that you said on the videotape in your testimony before the Senate committee was, we need to streamline the FBI bureaucracy in order to more effectively combat terrorism. To your knowledge, has the FBI changed? Are we more secure than we were before 9/11?
Well, the FBI is just one of 16 agencies. So it really, even if the FBI was doing everything right, it wouldn't really much matter in the scheme of things. Some things have improved, I think, in the FBI, but then many things have not. It's like one step forward and 2 steps back. The thing that has been 2 steps back, and I have already mentioned some of these things are counterproductive. And if you increase terrorism, now the latest national intelligence estimates, I go back, the national intelligence estimates, our intelligence community says that we have greatly increased terrorism because of the recruiting. And the attacks are about 4-fold worldwide. Now, if you think about this as let's say we're a soccer team, I don't care how good your goalie is. You can't increase the number of terrorists, or the opposite. It'd be like quadrupling the other team facing you. And that's the problem here. And the poor FBI, actually, you can sympathize with the FBI now playing the goalie role in Homeland Security. They're trying to prevent all acts of terrorism, and meanwhile, everybody else is messed up big time. You cannot increase the level of terrorism the way that we've done. Hurt our ability to work with allies around the world, and actually those are the things that will, all of these tools that the 9/11 Commission identified that we should be using to reduce terrorism. And in fact, we've done very bad things, and I think by using solely the military as a tool and doing many other overreactions, torture and stuff, we've hurt our...
Let's go to some questions from the audience, and if people can go to the microphone stand that we have set up. We can start with that. And have we got that set up?
Hi. Hello.
Yes, go
and
ahead.
Here in the middle.
Yes, we
Thank
see
you for your courage. What do you think? What do you say about the same 3 people blocked the memo from Phoenix, San Diego, and Minneapolis, and were then promoted?
And what was the last
And they
line?
were promoted.
Everyone who made, again, I talked about this wonderful, comforting thing that 9/11 couldn't have been prevented. Actually, I stopped at the director level, and I should have gone on to the presidential level. I stopped there, because it goes all the way up to the presidential level. It's a comforting thing. On top of that, the fact is the mistakes then, actually many of the people are promoted. And actually, I would say that this is probably one of the reasons that many people now are almost suspecting a conspiracy of sorts. I've been told many times, well, yeah, there's something going on. I said, well, in the government, if you had more than 2 or 3 people, it's going to be hard to keep a secret that way. But this is accountability, and you really have to have accountability in order to, again, if you don't admit the mistake, how can you fix it? And this isn't a wish to hurt somebody or to disparage, but you've got to have a way of identifying the mistake and not rewarding mistakes and promoting people. George Tenet marched off with the Medal of Freedom.
Can we bring up the house lights so we could see people a little bit more clearly from the stage, if that's possible? Yeah. And then the next person who has a question.
Yes, I'd like to ask if there might not be another level of denial that's still going on here, and that relates to the fact that there might be some level at the highest levels in our government that was involved with either letting the 9/11 occur or even assisting it. And I think there is some evidence in the Le Monde article of last week and Sybil Edmonds' testimony that's been covered up and some of the leaks from that. I would like you to comment also regarding your initial statement that you felt that the action at the highest levels of the FBI was like acting on the other side against everything you were trying to do.
One place in my memo, I probably, one part of ethical action, discernment, I always categorize it as 3 steps. Discernment, the courage to follow through, and then the last one, it's got to be constructive. Even if you know the right and wrong, you've picked out that this is, and you have the courage, you still got to figure out the most constructive means. In my memo, there's a footnote where I probably crossed the line and I wasn't so constructive by saying that, we're joking that the guy in headquarters is a mole for Osama bin Laden. That is the one place, if I had to rewrite it again, I would take that out. But with that said, it seems to me that the 9/11 Commission, once these things are unraveled, what they are identifying is serious negligence bordering on recklessness. And then in the spectrum of culpability, if you can prove criminal intent, for instance, it's a spectrum. And of course, negligence is on the line where you can just sue somebody civilly. It's not, you can't find somebody criminally at fault for negligence. On the other end is premeditated. What most people think of a real conspiracy is like the mob planning a hit or somebody, a real premeditated thing. But in the middle, there is reckless actions. And actually, you can actually prosecute somebody criminally. If they get inebriated and get into a car, that's reckless. And I think that that's kind of in this, all the facts of all of the things that were known and not known, at least from what I know, I would say a lot of it was negligence and bordering on recklessness. And I personally do not know, I have no knowledge of any anything that goes into that area of premeditated facts. But there's certainly, this press for 9/11 truth, it certainly identifies still to this day certain gaps. And again, I think one of the reasons why it took 3 years for the 9/11 Commission. I mean, can you imagine if Osama bin Laden took 3 years to, if he had a commission? I mean, this is terrible in the sense of trying to do it better. If we have to be much more honest and much more open and get to those mistakes a lot quicker, because we're always going to be making mistakes. But it's wrong to have this kind of pressure not to unravel them. And I think I'm going to go, sorry about this long thing here. I'm going to show, I have another example of something where people were misled for a while. Was A.G. Ashcroft. In 2003, began to get questions about library records. The FBI getting library records, and the ACLU and many librarian groups. In fact, I think 200 communities had passed resolutions that, about their concern about the FBI getting library records. Well, I knew this wasn't much of a problem. I knew that for starters, we had to go to the FISA court to get library records. And again, FISA court's kind of much more difficult. That's why Bush, made a rule that, he just, completely made it not necessary to have to go to the FISA court. So I knew that the library records wasn't a problem, but I knew that the national security letters for credit records, bank records, telephone tolls was a problem. And I figured out a constructive way to write this and get our FBI headquarters pre-publication review. And once pre-publication review passed on it, I went to the ACLU. I went to the head of the ACLU and I said, you know what? You're a little bit off track on your concern on library records. That's not much of an issue. First of all, what somebody checks out in a book isn't going to tell you who a terrorist is, and it's difficult. I said, but there's another thing. There's something else, national security letters. And you know why they got off on library records? Because when they asked Ashcroft for a year, is the FBI getting library records? He said, that's secret. I can't tell you, top secret. Now, what would most people think? And I think that is actually a lot of the facts in 9/11, why people are understandably questioning things, is because they have not been 100% forthcoming. If you see how the Bush administration fought the 9/11 Commission, it took the Jersey girls, the Jersey widows, to push for it. And if you see this type of thing, you naturally think, what are you trying to cover up? And Ashcroft actually, I think at a certain point, probably recognized that if they're on a red herring, all the better. Let them go for the library records, instead of the other things that are going on.
Good afternoon, Colleen, and welcome to Santa Barbara.